My name is Charles Whitmore, and I am 76 years old, a widower for more than a decade now, and I live alone in the same modest house on the edge of Cedar Falls, Iowa, where my wife Margaret and I raised our only daughter, Elaine. It is a small one-story house with a wide porch that faces the street, the kind of house that once seemed too cramped when Margaret and I were young and our daughter was a restless teenager. But that now feels cavernous, echoing with silence that sometimes presses so heavily against me that I have to turn on the radio just to remind myself that there is still life outside these walls. I wake early most mornings, not because I have pressing business or because my body is restless for labor, but because after so many years of working in insurance and then rising with Margaret to share coffee before she went to her teaching job, my rhythm was carved into me like an old groove on a record. These days, I still make the coffee, though it tastes flatter without her careful touch. And I sit at the kitchen table reading the paper, even though most of the news unsettles me, because routine is the only thing that steadies me. I have neighbors, of course, people who wave when they drive by, people who offer a polite greeting when we cross paths at the grocery store. But the truth is that my world has narrowed to a few simple rituals. The paper in the morning, a walk around. The block, if my knees will allow it, an hour tending the small garden Margaret loved. And in the evenings, a slow dinner eaten alone, while the clock ticks so loudly it feels like a reminder that time itself has grown louder as everything else has. Faded. I try not to dwell too much on loneliness, though it is the air I breathe most days, because I still have something that gives me reason to endure. I have 2 grandchildren, Emily, who is 19 and in college, and Jacob, who just turned 17 and is finishing high school. They are my bright stars, the last fragile link to Margaret's memory and to the sense of family I once believed would never leave me. When they were younger, before they had cars and friends and the distractions of adolescence, they would come over every weekend, and I would make pancakes and tell them stories about when their mother was small, how she once tried to run away from home because Margaret had made her clean her room before going to the skating rink, how she once painted the neighbor's dog blue because she thought it looked boring, how she loved to sing along with the radio even though she was always off-key. The children would laugh and ask me to repeat the stories, and Margaret, if she were in the kitchen preparing something, would smile at me with that look that said she was grateful for how much I loved being a grandfather. Those days have become memories, though sometimes they still shine so vividly in my mind that I can almost hear Jacob's boyish giggle or Emily's shrill laughter echoing down the hall. And for a moment, I forget the house is empty. Since Margaret died, things have not been the same between me and Elaine, my daughter, and I confess I still do not understand fully why. When Margaret was alive, there was always some tension between them. 2 strong-willed women who loved each other but often clashed over decisions, especially when Elaine married a man none of us particularly liked, a salesman named Robert, who always seemed more interested in his own opportunities than in steady family life. Margaret thought he was a showman, all smiles and promises without much sincerity, while I tried to believe that my daughter saw something in him that we did not. Over the years, however, I realized Margaret had been right more often than wrong, and though Elaine never admitted her husband's shortcomings aloud, I could see in her eyes the weariness of carrying the weight of a man who was not as dependable as she had hoped. Perhaps, in some twisted way, she resented Margaret and me for being right, or for being the quiet witnesses to her disappointments. After Margaret passed away, when grief left me raw and stumbling, I thought Elaine would step closer, that she would see how desperately I needed family around me. But instead, she grew colder, more distant, as though my sorrow embarrassed her, or, worse, as though she blamed me for it. In those first years after Margaret's funeral, I tried to visit Elaine's home regularly. I would bring gifts for the grandchildren, small things like books or puzzles, or a set of paints for Emily, who once loved to draw. At first, Elaine seemed welcoming, if somewhat rushed, but gradually she began to put up walls. There was always some excuse. Too much homework for the kids, too many commitments, or Robert needing quiet because of his work calls. And I began to realize that my presence was no longer desired. When the invitation slowed and then stopped altogether, I told myself it was simply the natural way of life, that children grow, parents drift, and the family circle is stretched thin by obligations and distance. Yet when holidays came and went without so much as a seat for me at their table, when birthdays were celebrated without my presence, the polite excuses began to sound like indifference, and indifference like rejection. Still, I clung to my connection with Emily and Jacob. They would call occasionally, at first encouraged by me to keep in touch, later perhaps more out of their own affection. Though the calls grew shorter as time went on, I would ask about their classes, their friends, their plans for the future, and I would remind them of little details from their childhoods that perhaps they themselves had forgotten, so that they might never doubt how closely I had paid attention to their lives. I did not care if the calls lasted only 5 minutes, or if sometimes they were distracted. To hear their voices was enough, a reminder that somewhere inside them still beat the bond of blood and memory. I told myself that Elaine might not value my presence, but the grandchildren would, because children remember kindness even when adults choose to forget. As the years pressed forward, my health began to falter in small but undeniable ways. My knees stiffened, my eyesight blurred more quickly in the evenings, and sometimes I lost my train of thought when telling a story, only to catch it again a few seconds later. These lapses frightened me, not because they were severe, but because I knew how people interpret the smallest signs of weakness in the elderly, and because I could feel the shadow of Margaret's absence more keenly when my body reminded me of my age. Yet I still managed my household, I paid my bills, I cooked my meals, and I kept the lawn trimmed as best I could. I was not helpless, not by any stretch, though I knew that to younger eyes, the picture of an old man living alone could easily be painted as a tragedy, or worse, as a problem to be solved. That fear of being seen not as a person, but as a burden, haunted me more than the loneliness itself. What comforted me, even on the loneliest nights, was the memory of Margaret's voice. She used to say, "Charles, you're steady as a rock. You'll carry on no matter what comes." And I believed her. I believed that as long as I had dignity and clarity of mind, I could endure the years ahead, even if Elaine never returned to me the warmth she once had. But I never imagined that the sharpest wound would not come from her absence, but from the slow realization that she had begun to twist my image even in the eyes of those I loved most. The first sign that something had shifted came not in the form of an open confrontation, but as a subtle change in the way my grandchildren addressed me, a faint but unmistakable hesitancy in their voices when they spoke on the phone, as though every word they chose had to pass through some hidden filter of suspicion, and I could not at first understand why the warmth that had once flowed so easily between us now felt constricted, restrained, almost rehearsed. Emily, who had always been the more affectionate of the two, began ending calls abruptly, citing endless assignments or new commitments with her friends, and Jacob, who used to linger on the line to tell me about a science project or some trouble with a classmate, now spoke as if wary of saying the wrong thing, glancing toward someone who might be listening nearby. His tone clipped and guarded, and I felt a chill, because such a change never arises without influence. I began to suspect, though I did not yet want to believe it, that my daughter Elaine had begun to whisper things into their ears, reshaping their image of me in ways that were not only unkind, but destructive. The confirmation arrived one Sunday afternoon when Emily called unexpectedly, her voice polite but tinged with a formality that did not belong to a granddaughter speaking with her grandfather. And after a few moments of small talk, she asked almost timidly whether I was managing okay at home by myself and whether I ever got confused with the stove or with my medicine. I laughed softly, trying to brush aside the odd question, telling her that I had been cooking for myself since before her mother was born and that I had never missed a day of my prescriptions. But even as I spoke, I could hear the doubt clinging to her silence, as though she was measuring my words against something she had already been told. Later, Jacob asked in his own hesitant way whether I still remembered the time they had supposedly visited me last week and brought me cookies, though the truth was that I had not seen them in months. And when I told him gently that he must have been mistaken, that perhaps he was thinking of another visit long ago, he grew quiet and then changed the subject quickly, a sure sign that he had not invented the story himself, but had heard it from someone who wanted him to believe it. It was then that I began to see the outlines of Elaine's campaign against me, a quiet erosion of my credibility, an attempt to frame me in the eyes of my grandchildren as a man whose memory was slipping, whose grip on reality was failing, so that, when the time came, she could say with confidence that she had only acted out of concern for my well-being. I tried to dismiss these suspicions as paranoia born of solitude, but the evidence grew too concrete to ignore. Neighbors who had always greeted me warmly began offering me sidelong glances, asking in tones of rehearsed sympathy whether I was getting enough rest, or whether I had family dropping by to help, as if I had suddenly become a man incapable of maintaining the simplest routines. At the grocery store, the cashier, who had known me for years, offered to double-bag everything so that I would not get mixed up at home. And when I asked her casually why she thought I needed the extra care, she murmured something about what your daughter said the other day, and I felt a cold knot in my chest, realizing that Elaine had extended her narrative beyond family, casting me as an object of pity or concern to anyone who would listen. One evening, unable to contain my unease, I called Elaine directly, determined to ask her outright what she had been telling people, but the conversation was a masterclass in evasion. She laughed when I raised the matter, saying that I was being oversensitive, that she had only mentioned to a neighbor that I sometimes forgot to take out the trash. And wasn't that the sort of harmless detail any daughter might share? But there was a sharpness in her voice that betrayed her irritation, a defensive edge that told me she had indeed been saying far more than she admitted. When I pressed, she snapped that I should be grateful she was looking out for me, that people would step in to help if something happened, and then she ended the call abruptly, leaving me staring at the phone with the sickening realization that my own daughter had decided to recast me, not as the father who had raised her, not as the man who had sacrificed his comforts for her education and supported her when her husband faltered, but as a frail liability whose decline she could announce as if it were inevitable. The next week I discovered something even more unsettling. I had stopped by the library, one of the few places where I still felt surrounded by the quiet dignity of books rather than the noise of suspicion. And while browsing, I overheard two women at a nearby table discussing how tragic it was when old people lost their minds. I would not have thought much of it, except that one of them mentioned a Mr. Whitmore, who lived nearby and who had started talking to himself on walks. My hands trembled as I closed the book I had been holding, because I knew they were speaking of me, and I had never in my life spoken to myself in public. Someone had planted that seed, and there was only one person who stood to gain from such a portrayal. The weight of these rumors began to crush me more heavily than loneliness ever had. It is one thing to be alone. It is another to be erased while you are still alive. to feel your identity being rewritten in the minds of your grandchildren, your neighbors, your community, until you no longer recognize the reflection they hold of you. I lay awake at night replaying every conversation with Emily and Jacob, every hesitant pause, every cautious word, and I wondered how much damage had already been done, how deeply Elaine's words had sunk into their hearts. For the first time since Margaret's death, I wept openly, not for myself, but for the thought that the bond between me and my grandchildren might be severed by lies, before it had a chance to outlast me. The catalyst, if I can name it as such, was not a single explosion, but a slow, relentless drip of poison, each drop falling into the well of trust until the water itself turned bitter. And I understood with a clarity that terrified me that Elaine was not merely distancing herself from me, but actively constructing a case, brick by brick, rumor by rumor, preparing a future in which I would be regarded not as a man, but as a problem to be managed, a confused old figure who could be guided, signed, away, and ultimately silenced. It was in that realization, heavy and undeniable, that the world I had clung to, the world of family, memory, and dignity, cracked open, and I saw the shape of betrayal waiting on the other side. The first true crack in the fragile surface of my relationship with my grandchildren appeared during what was supposed to be a simple Sunday dinner, a gathering Elaine had arranged at her house, and though I had accepted the invitation with some hesitation after the strange phone calls and whispers I had begun to sense in the weeks prior, I told myself that perhaps I was overthinking everything, that the affection of Emily and Jacob would shine through once we were face to face, that in the warmth of a shared meal, the heavy fog of suspicion would lift and reveal the simple truth of our bond. I dressed carefully that afternoon, wearing the navy jacket Margaret had always liked on me, pressing my slacks with the old iron till the creases were sharp. And as I stood before the mirror, I gave myself a quiet pep talk, reminding myself that I was not a man falling apart, not a feeble old relic, but someone who had lived a full life with dignity, someone who had raised a daughter and adored his grandchildren, someone who still had his wits and his pride intact. I carried that thought with me into Elaine's home, but it did not take long for the atmosphere to weigh against it. The moment I walked into the dining room, I sensed that I had stepped into a stage where the roles had already been assigned and rehearsed. Elaine greeted me with a smile that was too tight, too formal, as though I were a guest from outside the family rather than her father, and Robert, her husband, muttered a distracted hello without rising from his chair, his eyes already on his phone. Emily and Jacob stood nearby, polite but distant, their faces carrying expressions that looked rehearsed, as if they had been instructed on how to behave toward me. I embraced them both, feeling their shoulders stiffen under my hands, and I forced myself not to show the pang of pain that shot through me when Emily quickly pulled away as if my touch embarrassed her. The meal began with small talk, strained and shallow, and I tried to tell myself that they were simply tired, distracted by their own lives. But then came the first moment that made my stomach drop. I had just begun to tell a story, one I had told them before but that I knew they loved, about the time Margaret had insisted on baking cookies for the school fundraiser and had accidentally doubled the sugar, creating a batch so sweet that the children were bouncing off the walls for hours afterward, and I could already see the faint smile flickering across Jacob's lips when Elaine cut me off sharply, her voice pitched in that falsely patient tone that drips with condescension. "Dad, you've already told that story, remember? Last time you were here? The kids don't need to hear it again." Her words hung in the air like a slap, and I looked at Emily and Jacob to see if they would laugh it off, to see if they would reassure me. But instead, they exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting that same mixture of pity and doubt I had begun to fear. I wanted to protest, to insist that I had not told the story recently, that the last time I had even been in their house had been months ago. But I bit my tongue, realizing that to argue would only deepen the impression Elaine was crafting, that of a forgetful old man repeating himself. Later, when dessert was served, I noticed that my portion had been cut smaller than everyone else's, and when I asked half-jokingly whether I had been put on a diet, Elaine responded with a bright smile that carried the sting of a blade. "I just don't want you overindulging, Dad. Remember how you had trouble with your stomach last month?" The room fell silent for a moment, and I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth, because there had been no such trouble, no such incident, and in that moment I realized she was planting the seeds of frailty in front of my grandchildren, constructing a narrative in which I was not simply forgetful, but physically vulnerable as well. Emily's eyes darted toward me, uncertain, and Jacob's brow furrowed, as though trying to reconcile the image of the grandfather he knew with the version his mother was presenting. And though neither said anything, I could feel their belief tilting, sliding away from me toward the story Elaine wanted them to absorb. The humiliation did not end there. At one point, I rose to refill my glass of water, and as I carried the pitcher back to the table, my hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the simple nerves of being under scrutiny, and a few drops splashed onto the tablecloth. Immediately, Elaine rushed forward, dabbing at the cloth with exaggerated concern, exclaiming to the children, "See, this is why I worry. Dad's hands aren't steady anymore. Imagine if that had been something hot." Her tone was casual, but her eyes glittered with something darker, a satisfaction at having produced more evidence for her case, and I felt my cheeks burn with shame as Emily looked down at her plate and Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I wanted to shout, to demand that they see through her performance, but my voice caught in my throat, and instead I sat there silently, my dignity bleeding out onto the stained cloth between us. What struck me most painfully was not Elaine's words, but the silence of my grandchildren, the way they did not rush to my defense, the way they let her remarks settle as though they might be true. It was in that silence that I felt the first true escalation of this battle, the realization that Elaine had succeeded in driving a wedge between us, that my own flesh and blood had begun to doubt me, to see me not as the grandfather who had once carried them on his shoulders and told them bedtime stories, but as a man unraveling before their eyes. I saw it when Jacob hesitated to ask me for help with his college application, turning instead to his mother as if I were incapable of understanding, and I saw it when Emily avoided meeting my gaze, her expression caught between affection and suspicion, a tug-of-war that I feared I was losing. When the evening ended and I stepped out into the cool air, my jacket pulled tightly around me, I felt a hollowness I had never known before. The loneliness that had once been a quiet ache became a sharp wound, because now it was not simply the absence of company that haunted me, but the presence of doubt where there had once been trust. Elaine had begun her campaign in whispers, but now she had brought it to the dinner table, staging scenes of forgetfulness, frailty, and clumsiness for her children to witness. And the fact that they did not reject those scenes outright told me how deeply her influence had already sunk into their minds. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of a new and terrifying reality, that the battle for my dignity, for my truth, was no longer a private struggle, but a public one, waged in the eyes of those I loved most, and that, if I did not find a way to resist, to fight back, I would soon be erased not by age or illness, but by the deliberate hand of my own daughter. The breaking point came a few weeks later when Elaine invited me once again, this time to what she called a family evening. Though the moment I stepped through the door, I sensed that I was walking into something closer to a tribunal than a dinner, because everything about the atmosphere carried the stiffness of a staged performance. from the carefully set table with its polished cutlery and spotless glasses, to the way Robert stood at the counter pretending to be occupied with wine bottles, while Elaine busied herself with dishes, yet kept glancing at me with the sly anticipation of someone about to unveil an unpleasant surprise. Emily and Jacob were already seated, their expressions tense, as though they too had been told in advance that something was about to unfold. I greeted them warmly, trying to ignore the undercurrent, but I felt as though every gesture was being measured and every word weighed for evidence. Dinner began quietly enough, with small talk about Jacob's exams and Emily's plans for her next semester. But before long, Elaine turned the conversation toward me with an ease that felt rehearsed, asking in a voice that dripped with artificial sweetness whether I was managing to keep track of all my bills and whether I remembered to take the right dosage of my medications. I answered calmly, explaining that I had always kept meticulous records, that my checkbook was balanced to the cent, that I had my pills organized in a weekly case. But as I spoke, she kept smiling that thin, knowing smile. And then she leaned back in her chair and addressed her children directly, saying, "You see, he insists he's fine. But last week he called me twice to ask the same question about his insurance policy." Twice in one day. I froze, because no such calls had ever taken place, and I realized that she was not only twisting perceptions now, but inventing outright falsehoods, spoken boldly in front of her children so that their silence would become complicity. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and I looked at Emily, hoping she would contradict her mother, but she avoided my gaze, staring at her plate as though she could not bear to choose sides, while Jacob shifted uneasily in his chair, his jaw tightening but no words escaping. In that moment I felt the full cruelty of Elaine's strategy. She was not only poisoning their minds, but placing them in a position where to defend me would mean accusing their own mother of lying, and few children can muster such defiance. The weight of that realization struck me harder than any insult she could have hurled, because I understood that she was constructing a reality in which my truth would be buried beneath her authority as their mother. And even if they doubted her, privately, their silence would help her case. I tried to hold on to my composure, but the humiliation gnawed at me. And when Elaine, emboldened by their quiet compliance, began to recount another fabricated story, this time about how I had supposedly left the stove on and filled the kitchen with smoke, I felt something inside me snap. My hands shook as I set down my fork, and I said in a voice louder and sterner than I had intended, "That never happened, Elaine. You know very well it never happened. I will not sit here and listen to lies spoken about me in front of my grandchildren." The room fell utterly silent, the kind of silence that crackles with tension, and for a brief moment I thought perhaps my forcefulness might shatter her charade. But then Elaine leaned forward, her face a mask of feigned patience, and she spoke in a tone that carried both condescension and menace. "Dad, we don't need to make a scene. The children can see you're upset. Sometimes memory plays tricks, and that's normal at your age. We all understand." I felt the sting of those words more deeply than if she had shouted at me, because she had not only dismissed my protest, but transformed it into further evidence against me, casting my indignation as confusion, my defense as proof of decline. Emily finally looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pity, and Jacob muttered something under his breath that I could not catch. But neither spoke in my defense, and I knew then that Elaine's poison had taken root far more deeply than I had feared. For the rest of the meal, I could hardly taste a bite, every mouthful heavy with resentment. And when the evening finally ended, I left their house with the distinct feeling that I had not been a guest at a family dinner, but a defendant at a trial, where the verdict had already been decided. That night, lying awake in my bed, I replayed the scene over and over, hearing Elaine's words echo in my head. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this was not simply cruelty born of resentment or bitterness, but a calculated maneuver towards something larger. Why would she need to paint me as forgetful, as confused, as incapable? Why spread such rumors to her children, to the neighbors, even to strangers at the grocery store? And then the chilling thought came to me. She was building a case, preparing the groundwork to have me declared incompetent, so that she could assume control not only of my decisions, but of my finances, my house, my independence. The realization settled over me like a suffocating blanket, and though my heart pounded with fear, beneath it all there flickered a small spark of resolve. Because if that was her intention, then I could no longer afford to be passive, no longer afford to simply endure her humiliations. The midpoint of my ordeal had been reached. The family dinner where I was cast as a confused old man was not just another episode of humiliation, but the turning point where I saw her strategy laid bare, where I understood that this was no longer about hurt feelings or estrangement, but about survival, about whether I would be stripped of the last fragments of dignity and autonomy that remained to me. As I lay in the dark, I swore silently to Margaret's memory that I would not allow it, that I would find a way to show the truth, to prove to Emily and Jacob that their grandfather was not the figure their mother described, but the man who had loved them with every fiber of his being. The battle had begun in whispers. It had escalated to public humiliation. But now I knew what it truly was. A fight for my very identity and for the right to leave this world on my own terms. After that dinner, I no longer carried illusions that the distance between Elaine and me was simply the ordinary erosion that comes with age and the busyness of modern life. It had become unmistakably clear that she was crafting a narrative designed to strip me not only of dignity, but of agency. And though I wanted to believe that Emily and Jacob would see through it, their silence had shown me how dangerous her influence already was. In the weeks that followed, evidence of her campaign grew harder to ignore, not because I went looking for it, but because it began to find me, creeping into places where I had once felt secure. At the pharmacy, the clerk, who had known me for years and had always chatted pleasantly, suddenly began speaking in a slow, exaggerated voice, repeating instructions as if I were incapable of comprehending. And when I asked lightly why she was doing that, she admitted in a flustered tone that, "Your daughter mentioned you sometimes get confused with your prescriptions." At the bank, the teller politely suggested that I might want to consider adding a cosigner to my account for safety. And though she would not say who had planted the suggestion, I knew without asking. Each of these moments stung not only because they reflected Elaine's whispering, but because they revealed how quickly the world accepts such whispers when attached to the figure of an old man living alone. The escalation became undeniable one afternoon when a letter arrived by certified mail. A thick envelope bearing the letterhead of a local law firm I did not recognize. Inside was a notice informing me that a petition was being prepared to establish legal guardianship over me, on the grounds of diminished capacity. And though the language was cloaked in the sterile vocabulary of the courts, I understood instantly what it meant. Elaine was attempting to have me declared incompetent to seize control of my finances and decisions under the guise of protection. My hands trembled as I read, not because I doubted my clarity of mind, but because I understood the gravity of what I was facing, how easily a false narrative repeated often enough could be dressed up in affidavits and statements of concern, until it resembled truth. In that moment I felt not only betrayed but hunted, as though my own daughter had become the architect of my downfall. It was then that I resolved to take action of my own, to gather proof of my lucidity before her case could advance, and I began writing long, detailed entries in a journal every night, recording the day's events with precision, noting times, conversations, receipts, anything that could later serve as evidence of my memory and coherence. I also arranged a full medical checkup with my longtime physician, requesting written statements of my health and cognitive stability, and though he looked at me quizzically when I explained why, he ultimately agreed, saying he had never seen any sign of confusion in me and would vouch for my competence if called upon. These steps gave me a measure of reassurance, but they did not erase the ache of knowing that my own daughter was willing to drag me into court to prove that I was incapable of living my life. The true depth of her deceit revealed itself when Emily and Jacob came to visit one Saturday, a visit that at first filled me with cautious joy, because it had been months since they had set foot in my home. I prepared carefully, cleaning every corner of the house, organizing my paperwork neatly on the desk, even setting out photo albums so that they might remember the history we shared. When they arrived, their smiles seemed genuine, and for a short while it felt almost like old times as I served them the pancakes they loved as children and told them small anecdotes about Margaret. But as the conversation wore on, I sensed the shadow of their mother hovering in their words. Emily asked if I ever left the stove on by mistake, echoing her mother's fabricated story, and Jacob inquired gently whether I had trouble remembering which day to take the trash out, another detail that could only have come from Elaine. I answered each question calmly, showing them the neatly labeled pill box, the calendar on the wall where I marked appointments and chores, the orderliness of my bills. But beneath my calm, I felt the sting of realizing that they had come not to enjoy my company but to test me, to observe whether their mother's version of me was true. The moment that nearly broke me came when Emily, after a long silence, said softly, "Grandpa, Mom thinks maybe you'd be happier living with us, where we could help take care of you." "Wouldn't that be easier than being alone here?" My heart sank, because I recognized in her words not malice, but sincere concern born from her mother's manipulation. And though I wanted to lash out, to tell her that Elaine was poisoning their perception, I knew the anger would only confirm their fears. So I smiled gently and told her that I was grateful for her concern, but that I was perfectly capable of managing my life, and I could see in her eyes the battle between doubt and affection. That battle, I knew, was the true cost of Elaine's betrayal. It forced my grandchildren into a state of mistrust, tearing at the bond between us in ways that might never fully heal. The escalation did not stop with whispered questions or legal petitions. One evening, as I returned from my walk, I noticed Elaine's car parked outside my house. And when I entered, I found her inside, without invitation, rifling through drawers in the living room. When I demanded to know what she was doing, she claimed she had come to organize important documents before something happened. And when I protested that she had no right, she snapped that I was being paranoid, that she was only trying to protect me from myself. The audacity of her intrusion left me shaken, for it proved that she no longer saw me as the owner of my own home, but as a subject to be managed, a problem to be solved. From that day forward, I began locking not only my front door, but even interior drawers, as though I were a stranger in my own house hiding from an intruder who shared my blood. What struck me most in these weeks was not only Elaine's determination, but her confidence. The way she seemed certain that her plan would succeed, as though she already possessed the power she sought. It was then that I realized she must have been preparing for this for some time, gathering allies among neighbors, presenting herself as the dutiful daughter burdened with the care of an aging father, rehearsing the image of herself as savior while painting me as the confused dependent. That realization chilled me more than anything else, because it meant that by the time I had recognized her intentions, she had already laid much of the groundwork, and undoing it would require not only my resolve, but evidence so strong that even her children could not ignore it. Yet even as despair pressed against me, there were moments that rekindled hope. During one visit, as Elaine prattled on about how I had misplaced my keys 3 times in a week, Jacob's eyes flickered with doubt, and I saw him glance at the neatly hung keyring by the door, every key in its place. Later, as Elaine recounted another exaggerated tale of my supposed confusion, Emily bit her lip, as if something in her resisted the narrative. These flickers were faint, but they told me that perhaps not all was lost. That if I could find the right moment, the right words, I might pierce through their mother's deception. That hope became my lifeline, the reason I endured each humiliation without surrender, the reason I began preparing not just to defend myself, but to reveal the truth. The second escalation of my ordeal was not a single event, but a cascade of betrayals, each one building upon the last. The spreading of rumors to the community, the attempt at legal guardianship, the manipulation of my grandchildren, the invasion of my home, each cut deeper than the one before, until I felt that my very existence was being dismantled piece by piece. And yet within that dismantling something inside me hardened, a resolve I had not felt since Margaret's illness, when I had stood by her, side day after day, refusing to let despair steal our final moments. I told myself that just as I had carried her through those dark years, I would carry myself through this trial. And I would do it not only for my own sake, but for Emily and Jacob, so that one day they might know the truth of who their grandfather really was, untainted by their mother's lies. The breaking point arrived on an evening that Elaine herself had orchestrated, one she described as a family discussion, which I immediately recognized as her attempt to stage a decisive moment in her campaign. And though my instinct was to refuse, the invitation to shield myself from yet another humiliation, I knew deep inside that avoiding it would only allow her narrative to grow stronger, because she would present my absence as proof of confusion. So I gathered every ounce of resolve and went, determined not merely to defend myself, but to expose her for what she had become. When I stepped into her house that night, I felt a palpable charge in the air, as though the walls themselves knew a storm was about to break. Robert sat stiffly at the table, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding mine, clearly briefed to play his supporting role. Elaine greeted me with that saccharine smile that never reached her eyes, and Emily and Jacob lingered nearby, their postures uncertain, carrying the tension of young people caught between affection and suspicion, loyalty and doubt. We sat around the dining table, a spread of food untouched before us. But it was evident from the start that this was no dinner. It was a confrontation carefully choreographed by Elaine. She began with a sigh heavy with theatrical concern, speaking to the children more than to me, explaining how difficult it had become for her to manage Dad's lapses, how she worried every night that something terrible might happen. And then she listed one by one the fabricated incidents she had so carefully seeded. The stove left burning, the forgotten bills, the confused phone calls, each story polished as if rehearsed for the courtroom she so clearly intended to reach. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to sit still, to let her words hang in the air long enough for the children to taste their bitterness. At last I spoke, my voice steady though my hands gripped the edge of the table, and I said that none of those things had ever happened, that I had journals, receipts, and doctor's notes to prove it, that what their mother was describing was not reality but invention. Elaine laughed, not with humor, but with that condescending chuckle designed to undermine, and she turned to her children with the practiced calm of someone confident in her control, saying, "See, denial is part of it. He doesn't even realize." That was the moment I had anticipated, the moment where her confidence would overreach, And I leaned forward, fixing my gaze not on her, but on Emily and Jacob. And I began to recount in precise detail things only their grandfather could know, things no confused mind could summon. The exact words Emily had whispered to me the night she was 7 and couldn't sleep. How she had confessed she was afraid the stars might fall out of the sky, and how I had taken her outside and shown her the constellations until she calmed. The story of Jacob's first school play, where he had forgotten his line and nearly burst into tears until I mouthed it from the front row, steadying him enough to continue. As I spoke, I saw their eyes widen, saw the walls of doubt begin to tremble, because these were not the words of a failing mind, but of a grandfather who remembered every stitch of their childhoods with clarity and love. Elaine tried to interrupt, but this time Jacob raised his hand and said firmly, "Mom, let him talk." And the shock that flickered across her face gave me strength. I continued, telling them how their mother had not come to Margaret's funeral until 3 days after we buried her, how she had asked me, standing in the very living room we sat in now, whether I planned to sell my house before the earth on their mother's grave had settled, how she had spoken not as a grieving daughter, but as someone calculating assets. Elaine's cheeks flushed crimson, and she sputtered that I was inventing things, that my memory was twisted. But her voice carried a tremor she could not disguise, and Emily's eyes darted between us, searching for truth. Then came the moment of rupture. In her desperation, Elaine rose from her chair, slamming her hand against the table, and shouted, "Enough of this charade. Dad is not well, and you two need to understand that before he ruins everything for all of us." The mask slipped in that instant, her voice raw, not with concern, but with fury, and the children saw it. Emily flinched. Jacob stared at her with something like betrayal. And in the silence that followed, I spoke softly, almost mournfully, saying, "This is what I have tried to protect you from. Not my weakness, but your mother's lies. She wants you to believe I am fading so she can take what does not belong to her. She wants control, not care. You can see it now, can't you?" The room hung in suspension, and then Jacob, his voice trembling, asked her, "Mom, why would you say Grandpa called you twice in one day when he didn't? Why would you tell us he left the stove on if it never happened?" Elaine stammered, searching for words, but none came, and in her silence the truth emerged more powerfully than in any speech I could have given. Emily's face crumpled, torn between love for her mother and the dawning realization that she had been used as a pawn, and tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Mom, how could you?" That was the moment the balance shifted, the moment the children saw not the caricature she had drawn of me, but the cruelty etched into her own face. I did not press my victory, did not gloat or raise my voice, for the pain of the revelation was enough. Instead, I sat quietly, letting the silence speak, letting Elaine's unraveling anger condemn her more effectively than any accusation. When she finally collapsed into her chair, muttering about being unappreciated, about how she had sacrificed so much, Robert laid a hand on her shoulder, but his eyes betrayed unease, as though he too had grown wary of the mask she had worn for so long. The children remained silent, but the silence was no longer complicit. It was heavy with disillusionment, with the weight of a truth they could no longer ignore. That night, as I drove home through the darkened streets, my body still trembling from the confrontation, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a sense of vindication, the knowledge that the truth had finally pierced through the web of lies. The battle was not yet over. There would still be the matter of the guardianship petition, the legal fight to secure my independence. But the tide had turned, for Elaine's true face had been revealed to the very people she had sought to use against me. And as I sat in my quiet house once more, the clock ticking in the silence, I whispered to Margaret's memory that I had done as I promised. I had not surrendered, and I had shown our grandchildren the truth before it was too late. In the weeks that followed the storm inside Elaine's dining room, the air between us grew colder than I had ever imagined possible between father and daughter, for she no longer bothered to mask her hostility with sweetness or condescension. And when she did speak to me, it was only through curt phone calls or clipped messages that carried the brittle edge of someone who had been unmasked and now sought only to regain control through force. Yet the truth, once revealed, has a way of spreading its own light, and I could see that Emily and Jacob, though shaken and confused, began to step back from her shadow and approach me again with a new honesty in their eyes. Emily came first, knocking on my door one late afternoon with a tremor in her voice, confessing that she had believed her mother out of loyalty, but that what she had witnessed that evening had shattered something inside her, and she wanted to hear directly from me, without filters or accusations. We sat at the kitchen table for hours as I showed her the journals I had kept, the doctor's statements, the meticulously organized bills and notes, and I told her not only about the recent months, but about Margaret, about the life we had built and the care we had poured into Elaine when she was young. And as I spoke, I could see the lines of doubt on Emily's face soften into something closer to remorse. Jacob came a week later, restless and angry, blurting out that he could not believe his own mother had lied so openly. And though his words carried the fury of youth, I calmed him gently, reminding him that anger, though righteous, can eat away at love if left unchecked. I told him that Elaine was still his mother, still a part of him, and that while her choices had hurt us deeply, I did not wish for him to carry hatred in his heart. For hatred is a poison that seeps from one generation to the next, if left to grow. Unchecked, he listened, his fists unclenching as I spoke, and in that moment I felt a small measure of healing begin. The restoration of a bond that Elaine had tried to sever, but which blood and truth had proven stronger than deceit. The legal matter came swiftly after, for the petition Elaine had filed could not be ignored, and I found myself sitting in a courtroom where strangers weighed the question of my competence as though it were an equation to be solved. Elaine stood there with her lawyer, presenting affidavits filled with distortions and half-truths. But when it came time for testimony, Emily and Jacob both refused to support her claims, telling the judge that they had no reason to doubt my memory or my stability, and their words, spoken calmly and without hesitation, carried more weight than any document Elaine had prepared. My doctor's statement further reinforced the truth, and when the judge finally declared that there was no basis for guardianship, I felt not relief so much as exhaustion, the kind that seeps into one's bones after months of carrying a burden too heavy to name. Elaine left the courtroom without a glance in my direction, her face pale with fury, and though part of me longed for reconciliation, I knew as I watched her go that some rifts cannot be mended, not when ambition and resentment run deeper than love. In the quiet that followed, I returned to my routines, my small house with its ticking clock and its garden where Margaret's roses still bloomed each spring. But now I was no longer entirely alone, for Emily began visiting more often, sometimes bringing her textbooks to study at my kitchen table, sometimes simply sitting with me in silence, and Jacob came by on weekends to help with the yard, though I suspected he did it more for the conversations we shared than for the work itself. Slowly, cautiously, the laughter of youth returned to my home, faint echoes of the days when they were children and Margaret's voice still filled the rooms. And though the absence of Elaine left a wound that would never fully close, I found solace in knowing that the thread of family had not been completely severed. I have come to accept that I may never again share an honest meal with my daughter, that she may live the rest of her life seeing me not as father who raised her, but as the obstacle she could not overcome. And that is a sorrow I will carry to my final days. Yet in the same breath I know that my grandchildren saw the truth before it was too late, that they refused to become tools in her scheme, and that they now know me not as a frail shadow, but as a man who endured betrayal without surrendering to it. That knowledge steadies me in the dark hours of the night when loneliness presses hardest. For I understand that legacy is not measured in money or property, but in the memories carried forward by those who come after us. And in that sense, Margaret and I have not been erased. The resolution of this long ordeal was not triumphant in the way of fairy tales, for I did not win back my daughter's love or restore the family to its former wholeness. But life is rarely so clean, and what I gained instead was something quieter yet, perhaps more enduring, the vindication of truth, the restoration of trust with Emily and Jacob, and the knowledge that even in the face of betrayal, a man can hold fast to dignity. As I sit now on the porch in the evenings, the sun dipping low over Cedar Falls, I sometimes hear the laughter of my grandchildren drifting from the kitchen. And in those moments, I know that though Elaine tried to erase me, I remain present in the lives of those who matter most. And when the day comes that I leave this world, I take comfort in believing that they will remember me, not as the caricature their mother tried to paint, but as the grandfather who loved them fiercely, remembered them faithfully, and fought quietly, yet firmly for the truth of who he was.